I have the pleasure today of being joined by Peter Haas. He is an ordained minister and a scholar based in Austin, Texas. Went to Princeton Seminary. And today we're going to be discussing the topic of spirituality in nature. And Peter is absolutely a lover of nature. I think I have that right. So welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lee. It's an honor to be with you today.
Well, just getting started here. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and life story, if you will, where you grew up, your connection to nature, starting from when you were a kid, your parents, and just how life unfolded and, how you got to where you are today and your relationship now with nature?
Sure. Uh, my mom gave me so much of a love for nature. The more uh, as I get older, I see how she imprinted me. She told me the story once that when she was a teenager, like 18 or 19, she would go out to a nearby forest. It's called the Kettle Moraine State Forest in Wisconsin, where I grew up, southeastern Wisconsin. Um, about an hour and a half from Aldo Leopold's little shack or
Mm.
cabin. Um, but anyway, it's just beautiful forest, and they have done a lot of planting of evergreen trees or pine trees. And the interesting thing is that she would walk in the forest and pray and just disappear. She loved to be alone in forest, and I'm the same way. And in fact, there's a forest there that they planted the year of my birth in the Kettle Moraine State Park, and it's kind of sandy soil there. And so my whole life we've been walking in that woods and in the forest. It's man-made planted forest, but nevertheless it's stunningly beautiful. And over the years they've harvested trees. So it's just been this neat connection, like a mirror of my life. As I've grown older, the trees have grown older, and it's been very poignant to walk there. So I don't know. I feel like my mom gave me the love of nature, and I had it in my bones, my DNA, and I felt so blessed to have grown up in a place like Wisconsin. At the time, I didn't realize how astounding Wisconsin was, but over the years, I've just fallen in love with it all the more. So,
And were both of your parents close to nature, and had you and your siblings spend a lot of time in it?
well,
I know you moved
not
around some.
yeah. My dad was not so much a nature guy at all. He loved to take walks, but he grew up more in the city. So I got my love for nature from my mom, I think, and we ended up moving to this commune in Oregon in the early '80s, 1980, 81, and I call it the best of times, the worst of times, because we had like an 80-acre farm, and I had the Applegate River behind our little A-frame, no electricity, no running water, no heat. We just had a wood burning stove and an outhouse, and then we'd have to go up to the main house, the commune house, for food and hot water baths and whatnot. But as a little boy, 9, 10 years old, it was magical to just have the free reign of that nearly 100 acres, 5 acre garden. We grew a lot of food there, and of course, I had the chores of taking care of the let's see, there were goats, there was a pig, two or three pigs. That was awesome, and then the pasture was full of a couple cows, one in particular named Clara, who did not like to be milked, but after she was milked, she'd chase me with the pails. I think I lost half the milk running away from her.
So
Anyway,
you
yes.
you had a real hands-on connection then, which is great. That's such a good foundation. And then how did that manifest as you became older? I know you had some career choices, and can you talk about that a little bit?
I think emotionally, I didn't know it at the time, but emotionally, as a kid, I resonated with nature and the weather and the mountains and the trees. That at some level, it was like the environment of my inner world was deeply formed by my relationship to and seeing of beautiful things, the beauty of nature, the beauty of mountains, the beauty of the ocean, and it really comforted me and spoke to me. And I took a lot of I took refuge in it, especially the worst of times in the commune, it was a very difficult place to live, um, for various reasons. There were some really weird things that were happening, and I was very scared and stressed. And so I would look out at the mountains in the distance and feel great comfort just looking at them. They were friends to me. And also, I would also feel trapped by them. And I'd also feel trapped by the low-hanging gray, rainy clouds throughout the winter. I remember as a kid wanting to take a rake and just rake the clouds away. It was so depressing month after month in the winter in Oregon. I wanted to escape the commune and go back to Wisconsin. So I don't know. It was a mixed experience. We moved back to Wisconsin and we lived in a little suburb, basically, of Milwaukee. And so I went back to normal suburban life, and it was quite a shift. Um, but that's when we would go and take walks in the nearby state parks and state forests. You know, I did when I hit high school. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. In fact, I knew I just loved being in nature and loved rock climbing and loved going and spending time at Devil's Lake State Park. I even quit my junior JV football team so I could spend the fall going up to Devil's Lake State Park because I preferred to be there than playing football. And I think it was my junior year. I went into the guidance counselor's office and I was leafing through little pamphlets of different schools, and I saw this pamphlet that had pine trees on the cover, and I love pine trees. They're my favorite tree. And I opened it up, and it was a brochure for Northland College, which at the time in the late 80s um, was the nation's only environmental education outdoor ed school plus forestry uh, minor degree. And I just fell in love with it and ended up going there for a little bit, um, and realized I wanted to be a forest ranger. I thought this is awesome. I could take people hiking and climbing and you know spend my life in the place I love and make a living doing that.
And so what happened in terms of, I don't want to say detour, but you ended up going a different direction, and you just tell a little bit about your religious formation and, even as a kid, but, how you ended up going to seminary and that whole path.
Yeah, I mean, Martin Luther, the famous Reformed theologian, somewhere along the line, he said something like, just look to the scriptures, for they will reveal to you the only God we've got. Um, and it's as good as it's going to get, basically. Hold on to the scriptures, hold on to what the scriptures teach, because it's as good as it's going to get. And I like to say, well, that's true. That's been true for me. But also, I hold on and let nature hold on to me, particularly beautiful places of solitude. So for me, it's as if God is as close to me uh, as anything through nature. It might as well be, I might as well say God is nature. I know that's not theologically accurate to say, but it's as if it's that close to me that the veil of whatever divine energy of love is is coming through the beauty, the symmetry, the harmony of nature, the chaos of nature, all of it, the power of nature. It's as if nature is God, and so it doesn't surprise me that I love nature and I love spirituality, and I was kind of attracted to both, and I couldn't figure it out as a young man. I couldn't separate one from the other, but that started to happen, unfortunately, and I started to feel this attraction to being a pastor, which um, as I look at my journals and I think about those decisions I made. I was at Northland College that fall, my first fall semester, and I remember thinking, well, number one, I had a hard time passing the algebra and advanced algebra classes and chemistry that I knew I would need to have for the degree, to be a forest ranger. And I was much more competent in the language skills and arts and whatnot, more liberal arts stuff. And I remember thinking, maybe I don't need to make a living doing the very thing I love to do the most, being in nature and maybe I don't need to make a living doing that. Maybe I keep that just for myself. Maybe nature is just for my soul and being with God. And maybe I make a living doing something else like being a pastor or a teacher or writer. And so that was a big part of my decision process to leave Northland College and go to a college in downtown Chicago, which was a totally drastic difference. Went from the shores of Lake Superior to the very, very crowded, urban setting of downtown Chicago.
That reminds me of a Jackson Brown line, I think, in a song where he says, "Got to do what you can to keep your love alive. Try not to confuse it with what you do to survive." So looks like your
That's good.
dog maybe like, yeah.
Yeah, she's like, hello, love me.
So you ended up leaving Northland, and where did you go to seminary?
Yeah, so I went to Moody College. It's a Bible school in Chicago, and then from there I went to Princeton Seminary, um, and definitely became ultimately became a Presbyterian minister along the way. So it was a good journey. Um, I I left what I would call as my family of origin spirituality, which is much more evangelical, much more fundamentalistic. I didn't know what I was in until I started studying and seeing the bigger perspective. And so I started being drawn to the Presbyterian, the more open, liberal side of the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, and and I could integrate my spirituality with nature. Uh, and John Calvin was a favorite of mine in seminary, but he says, basically that there's the book of God or book of Revelation, and then the book of nature, and that both of them work hand in hand. And I kind of love that. In the Reformed tradition, the created order, including humanity and all the science and all our knowledge, is a part of worship. That everything we do is for the glory of God, including being stewards of the earth. So
Well, I think that's a really good segue into our topic, and that is, and I know you're a scholar, you understand and can transcribe Greek, and I know you've done a lot of reading and studying over the years of various scripture and spiritual texts. Can you talk a little bit about the beginnings of religion, going way back, even, predating our modern religions, big four or whatever you want to call them, and the roots that the very earliest, humans had, connection to nature. And I know it's often referred to maybe as animism, but can you speak to that and then how that's over time, changed or developed?
yeah, I think there are a couple different developmental models out there, and the traditional model, places the evolution of human beings, um, basically waking up from the plains of the Serengeti or whatever, and becoming Homo sapiens and smart animals, and having this self-awareness and being able to know that we know, and then language, and then you know tools and whatnot, and that whole evolution of this is one model that basically is kind of the dominant model, where these little tribes gather together, and they shift from being hunter gatherers to being agrarian and settled in little tribes or little villages, and being able to control their food supply was huge. And they had surplus, and then so not everyone needed to work, and so the guilds started up, or the trades, or the priests, or the different classes of people that didn't have to, so to say, go hunting. They could have a little temple, they could have a little religious ritual. And then of course with the agricultural revolution, that just exploded all the more in the major delta regions of the Euphrates and the Nile, and the major cultural centers. And then from there, organized religion and the organized state just went hand in hand, for most part, um, all the way through the flourishing of the monotheistic traditions. Um, and that's certainly one model. So there's this presupposition that the earlier tribal-based, pre-agrarian-based cultures were animistic or just less hierarchical and whatnot. Uh, I just I think there's probably not much anthropological evidence one way or the other. I tend to be open to. I think our origins are much more mysterious than we could ever imagine, and certainly not as linear as they've been described. Um, and I don't. I think things were happening in different ways in different parts of the world. But for me, the bottom line is that the evolutionary developmental model presupposes that we were moving from simplicity to complexity. Um, I actually don't don't really believe that that's how it happened. Um, I have much bigger view of some of humanity, at least, maybe not all of humanity, or certain certain aspects or certain parts or time frames of humanity, where you can put it in this way. I believe that the planet has been visited. However we got here, whether it was from divine creation or other art, higher levels of intelligence seeding the earth. I see this place as a massive seed planted with everything in it to grow and flourish, kind of like um, you know, like one of those care packages mom would send. If you went off to college, it had a basket full of everything you need. Um, and so I tend to think that actually it's not this evolutionary coming up from little cells moving up to higher complicated organisms, but probably the other way down, coming from above down. So involution and evolution probably somehow intertwined. And I think there's some good biblical evidence for that. Like the concept of the Nephilim in the book of Genesis, that they're viewed as the angels or the higher beings that are breeding with the human beings. It's right before the flood, Genesis chapter 5 and 6, where the Nephilim start to appear on the planet. You know, I don't know what to really make of all this, but I, I, I just think the evolutionary models that we've got today have these huge gaps in them, and they just make absolutely no sense to me, and it raises tons and tons of questions, just as many questions as the traditional viewpoint of God creating, human beings. I think somewhere in between is there's truth in both viewpoints, um, and so I don't know. It's not as a tidy developmental story as I think some would like to make it, um, and I think it's much more complicated and beautiful and sacred.
Yeah, I've been reading quite a bit recently on science needing to revise some of those models for a variety of reasons, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean,
Is it
just placing, like they used to place the Neanderthal culture, at a certain place, and now they have to keep pushing everything back, and just the art that they're discovering gets older and older. It seems to be like, well, wait a minute, things don't line up like we thought they might. It's much bigger.
Well, it's interesting. In a recent conversation about bird language and some of the scientific discoveries that my professor I co-teach with has made in the lab, and the sort of running commentary for years is that, well, indigenous people have known this for thousands of years. They may not have known it in the lab, like acoustical analysis, but they knew on a practical level what was going on. And so I think that, and in fact, professor was saying, I learned some humility in that, and that,
Yeah.
a lot of these things have been going on, or there's been a lot more complexity, as you say, than I think we want to give prior cultures credit for. Um, is it fair to say, though, that the earliest human civilizations, that nature was very important, close to them, and as you said, almost inseparable from their spiritual religious beliefs or practices, and that over time, particularly Western development, but we've moved from, again, more the hunter gatherer to And I think even in the Bible, in the Jewish Bible, there's the part of Nimrod, the stories, the hunter gatherer, and then kind of seemingly a preference for more the pastoral lifestyle, the shepherder. And then of course today, we become industrial. I don't know if you could speak to that and about that move and how that happened and or why that happened.
Yeah, I mean, I just have my personal viewpoints. I've read recently, that they've found archaeological remains of Neanderthals, or even the species be, before Neanderthals, where they used to think that they didn't care about each other. They're just tribal and very aggressive, but actually they found little infants buried with like feathers or special trinkets. And I thought how tender, or put that they've literally ensconced a baby infant that died in the embrace of the wings of a bird. Um, so this kind of fusion of life with the animal life, I think is I think was pretty natural for the earliest human beings, and even before Homo sapiens. I think there was a connection, obviously, and that to me seems to accord well with like the image of the Garden of Eden, that humanity did begin in some interconnected place of, you could romanticize it, I guess. I don't think that things were as uh, as as benign as maybe the story presents, because I don't want to romanticize nature. It can kill you, and it has killed us. And I would much rather live after 1850, after we discovered germs and anesthesia and all this stuff. So I don't, if I went into the Amazon forest right now, I would die pretty quickly. So I don't want to romanticize it, but at the same time, I think there was, in that animistic perspective, a real harmony of what I would just say is that communication of knowledge, of being able to intuit knowledge and feel knowledge from trees, from the sky, from the birds, from the animals, from the plants, and even the soil. I think there was, if anything, marks the difference between our civilization and the prior civilizations. It's that deep intuition of knowing through nature that we've lost touch with. I think somewhere, someone calls it the Great Conversation. Belden Lane has a book called The Great Conversation, and he's quoting, I think, either Aldo Leopold or John Muir. I think he's quoting John Muir, saying that we've lost the ability to have the great conversation with nature, and I think that's true. We're so distanced from nature now, that we know by third or fourth hand, not intuitively. Um, and so I think that the archaeological and anthropological record bears that out, that there was certainly an awareness, that deep intuition type of knowing. And then that gets me to what I would call some of the developmentalists of consciousness theories, that one of the more famous philosophers of our time, Ken Wilber, articulates in his theories of the spectrum of human consciousness. And whatever you make of his developmental model, there are lots of different developmental models, but basically he starts out the human civilization at the Euroboric phase, which is the fusion of nature and man, that you can't separate the two. It's the image of the snake eating its tail. It's kind of this blissful, romanticized union of man and mankind and nature. And then what he calls the great fall upward. It wasn't a fall down. It wasn't a loss of knowledge. It was a gaining of knowledge. So we entered into that next level of development, of separation, the mythic and the magical dimensions of consciousness. And he charts this all out in history, and he basically gets to what some call the great axial age, about 2500 BC, basically as the initiation of what he calls the rational egoic stage of human consciousness, which we've been in which started with the awakening of democracy and early science philosophy, and culminated, really in the last 300 years, say the Industrial Revolution. So we've been living now on probably in a new phase, the Anthropocene, or even more, where human beings made, some say, need to go away, and we just allow AI to take over. So we're definitely living in an evolutionary moment. But for most of recorded human history, we've been in that rational egoic level of consciousness, which I think for many people has involved what I would use the word domination of nature at at the expense of nature. Human beings have thrived at the expense of nature, and the exponential curve of domination has just, in the last 300 years, the age of exploration led to the age of technology, and we've essentially conquered everything that can be conquered on this planet. We've ruined it in a certain sense, and now we're going to ruin other places in the universe, the moon, and what's next. So it's very interesting that for me, as my critique of humanity on this planet has been one of really the last blink of an eye period of time, last 300 years or so, has done more damage to the earth, that we have had more of an impact on the earth by way of our domination of it. On the one hand, it's given us incredible access to electricity and scientific knowledge, like vaccines that can be developed, the discovery of the double helix DNA, brain surgery, open heart surgery, just incredible blessings that we have because of this domination of nature. And somehow there's got to be a rebalancing, I think, um, of coming back into partnership, not domination. But there was such a push, there's just been a 3, 4, 500 year push for this conquering of the open spaces and conquering of the open lands and the new continents, and that's been our consciousness: is keep growing, keep expanding, keep eating, keep making things better. I was just in Iowa, and you can drive for hundreds of miles and see just acres and acres, thousands, millions of acres of 14-foot stalks of corn. Just they perfected it, and it's just, there's something bizarre about it. Just two crops, soy and corn in a whole state. You can drive for 4 hours and it's just hundreds of miles of corn, and they've perfected it. And you need massive tractors running 24 hours, massive fleets of tractors and combines running 24 hours to harvest all that stuff and plant all that stuff, all dependent upon diesel. And yet, there's something extraordinary about that, and something terribly, you know, almost like a Frankenstein, fields of Frankenstein. I don't, scientists have engineered these corn to grow so tall and produce these massive yields, and it's perplexing to me. I wonder about it all.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. A number of trains of thought jumping around in my mind on that. One thing
Yeah, that's the problem with interviewing a pastor. We just keep going.
No, it's I think it's more the topic, actually. It's just so much introduced there. One of the things that jumped out when you said that is, and this is, I think, an existential question, really. Going back to, say, the story of Genesis and kicked out of the Garden of Eden, there's this message, and as you pointed out, understandably so, that you're going to toil. Nature is hard, and there seems to be a continuing story of, at least in Western civilization, and I lived all over the world. Even in China has a similar thing of trying to control nature, and not that it's necessarily bad, but you want to put it in a box, make it work for you, take the wildness out of it. And, in the Bible or scripture, it talks about, again, this move from sort of the hunter gatherer seems to be at least post Nimrod, and that story of, the hunter gatherer, to more pastoral. And then in Western civilization, more recent times, that, as you said, controlling nature, and there's all these, nasty aspects of it, getting diseases, et cetera. There seems to be like a psychology there. And what I find really interesting is the dichotomy between that and, certainly what I believe we're hardwired for. It's in our DNA. And, here we are in modern culture, this postmodern society, and there's this crave to get back to nature. And of course, we've lost a lot of it, particularly in our urban landscapes. And it's just really interesting, that dynamic, those two forces kind of competing against each other. And so I don't know if, from both a religious standpoint and a psychological standpoint, if you have any insights there, and, and this kind of modern longing for reconnection to maybe what we've lost.
Yeah, I mean, those are wonderful questions and ponderings. Um, I always found it interesting that the Bible's, the Jewish Hebrew scriptures begin in a garden, and the Bible, as we know it, the Christian scriptures, end in a heavenly city. Now, that's very specifically defined what the city looks like. Um, and so there does seem to be this implicit bias toward development equals technology. Development equals transformation of nature and domination of it. Uh, Many have criticized Christianity because of that. There's that implicit bias toward it. Like, you know, the wilderness was the place where God wasn't. That's where the demons were. That the wilderness was the place where they wandered, and then they were trying to get to the promised land. And when they got to the promised land, they could build, Jerusalem. Um, so there's this sense of evolutionary development happening, and that the nest that is Eden was here to be controlled and manipulated and developed, and to create the city of God. And in Judaism, the city of God, Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, is very important. The navel of the world. It's the center of God's creative activity on this planet. Um, so I think that accords well with the whole developmental model and the evolutionary model that we superimpose over the Western tradition as well as the Eastern development in China and India and other places. That there is this movement into complexity, into from simplicity to complexity to hegemony in many ways. Power being more and more centralized, and as a result, there's a certain control over nature that has been wielded. And he who controls the food controls the world, or she who controls the food controls the world. So that's been a huge part of all of this, and so, what now? And I think we do find that there is this intuition that a lot of people have. They may not be able to express it, but why do you go out into nature? Why are you longing to get back into the nature? You live in this very urbanized setting, but you disappear on the weekends, or you take your summer trips to go be in nature, or you have extreme sports to get out into nature more readily. I think underlying that is this deep spiritual seed of hunger that, like St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until we find rest in thee, O God. But similarly, I think nature is the face of God. It's the closest many of us will ever get or feel to God, the mystery that is God, the love that is God, the order of God's intelligence and mind and symmetry and beauty, all the things that the Greeks meant by the word logos. And so I do believe that nature becomes a very safe place for people to be reminded who they are, and to feel that connection non-cognitively. They feel it through their emotional center, their physiology. Just breathing in the way that the air smells in the Tetons changes me. Just looking at the Milky Way when I'm up in northern Wisconsin changes me. Feeling and tasting snow on a winter's day in Iowa changes me. Standing in the uplands of the rolling, you know, fields of Iowa just the other day, where the wildflowers were let to grow instead of the corn. It was as if I was in heaven. And so I think even people who would define themselves as being not spiritual or not even theists, maybe someone who said, I'm a hardened atheist, firm and fast, even they would say there's something about being standing in the pine forest, listening to the whir of the wind through the pine trees. Something in them stirs, and that wind touches them in a deep way. They might as well just call it God. But it's an ephemeral experience that teaches them that they're contingent and they're also connected. They're part of the whole. And I think that's the essence of spiritual life, is to be reminded we're part of the whole. And therefore we can love one another, and ethics come out of that and all that. And, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love the tree as you love yourself.
It's really interesting. I was hearing you describe that narrative of, moving from the very primitive, lifestyle, hand to mouth kind of existence, and then the, city. And yet, and in the Jewish scriptures, it's very clear in the Old Testament. And yet there's this contra narrative, if you will, in the New Testament, where, Jesus, his parables, his teachings, so much of them are about nature and very visceral.
Yeah.
John the Baptist, his lifestyle, I know we don't know a lot about him, but, it's clear he was a wilderness guy. I just find that dichotomy really interesting. And it seems like there's something there. I mean, I know they were parables and people could relate to them, but it seems like there was something more than that. There's actually something literal in terms of having that connection. And you described it, I think, really well with some of those experiences that, you still have.
Yeah, I mean, Abraham, Moses, Elijah, all these holy men were recharged, and they spent a lot of their time out in the wilderness alone with God, with the wilderness. John the Baptist, Jesus did the same as well. They recharged almost like they preferred being alone into the wilderness, and then they would spend their energy when they're with people in the cities. Um, so it's very interesting how, and then of course the earliest monastic communities, at least within Christianity, very quickly by the second or third century, the Common Era, they were retreating into the desert wastes of Egypt and Cappadocia and
Those are
you
the
know
desert fathers, right?
desert fathers and mothers. Yeah,
Yeah.
so um, there was something they recognized that solitude, that silence, that simplicity, that being in the wilderness was very, very supportive to helping them remember God and helping them remember themselves and listening for that inner voice. So
Let me ask you this. I know you have a fascination with survival, right? And read a lot about that. Can you tell us about that? And just personally, why it appeals to you and how it relates to this discussion? And also, though, in, literally, what you've gotten out of it. And because I know you've had some actual fruits from that and learnings.
yeah, well, I think the first thing is that I just want to admit that when living in Austin, Texas, um, I I get stir crazy in the summer because it's so hot, and so I tend to read these books about wilderness survival or survival stories or rescue stories that are set in you know alpine settings, snow and ice, and so it's kind of like escape therapy for me in the middle of the summer, 3 4 months of 100 degrees. But I discovered a writer by the name of Lawrence Gonzalez, who wrote a very masterful book called Deep Survival, and it's full of stories of survival and rescue. And basically, he's trying to figure out what's the mindset behind or within people that survive and what's the mindset of people who don't. And it's fascinating, his conclusions, but essentially it's very, very neurological, conclusion that those of us who can control our left brain uh, fear, I should say our right brain with their left brain, that we can be more logical and not let the fear take over, uh, can oftentimes survive, um, because they don't flip out or really flee. But anyway, it seems to be a fascinating thing to see that there are certain traits that you can cultivate to help you be a survivor no matter what. Um, so I just love adventure stories that are set in the Arctic or in the mountains. I always have as a little kid. Just love those sorts of stories, rescue stories or adventure stories or escape stories. Uh,
Yeah, I've read a number as well, and I know you've read the account by Cabeza de Vaca or
yeah, yeah, you put
L'Encarnacion.
me onto that.
It's just so amazing. One of the things I wonder is that, back then people were so much closer to death because it was all around them that I don't want to say they were more comfortable with it, but I wonder if some of that neurological aspect you talk about not having the fears because they knew that was going to be their fate. And we spend so much time now, obviously, and we've gotten really good at it in many respects of avoiding that or pushing it off to the very last moment, uh, because of all the medical breakthroughs that we've had through the ages. So I just wonder if they were, because they were closer to that, they had almost already accepted it in a way, that was going to, and of course it's going to be all of our fate, but it's almost like we're in a disillusioned state, thinking that's not going to happen. But I guess with all of those, and Cabeza de Vaca is a great story. I don't want to ruin the ending, but after this incredible ordeal of 7 years and, the first, as far as we know, European American actually living here, and all the things he went through after all that time, and he makes it back to Mexico City and the travails and what have you. And he goes back and he to Spain for I think a couple of years, and then he volunteers to do it all over again in South America. That's what I could not believe. um, I have an uncle, similar mindset, as a POW in Korea, and I was like, "Gosh, didn't you want to get out of the service?" And me, came back, and he's like, "No, I just, I figured it was going to come around again, so I'll just keep on going." That mindset's amazing, and so
Yeah.
I, I I don't know if you have any comments on that, but also for people that have experienced that type of hardship, and just in general, like you said, living 300 years or prior to 1850, with that kind of harshness of nature and day-to-day existence, it'd be pestilence, drought, flood, what have you, attack from Genghis Khan and his horde coming in, whatever it is. How do you reconcile that? And I'm asking you personally, between that and the beauty of nature that you talked about, because they just seem to be in one extreme. And yet, obviously, we have to live with both of those. So, how do you deal with that personally?
Well, it's for me. I welcome anything that reminds me of my contingency, and that leads to humility. And so, I guess from a spiritual practice perspective, that nature um, is is a partner that we are to live in harmony with, and that will require discipline and sacrifice and patience on our part, um, drawing it out, drawing a life out from the barrenness of or the difficulty of nature. You can't just expect to survive. There is going to be sacrifice required. You will probably have to kill an animal to live if you're all alone in the wilderness. You will have to find out where to eat. Um, you will need to find out how to have shelter because temperatures will kill you. So I think this does create a certain sense of humility and contingency and just a kind of an abandonment unto God, which is why, trusting in the will of God was a big part of so much of human history, because people realized they weren't in control as much as they were controlling their life. They really did know, I think, how much they weren't in control, which does fascinate me. Why some people return to situations where they're not in control. Um, like Ernest Shackleton, he was, as a young man, he went down to the Antarctic. He escaped narrowly, and then couldn't wait to get back. And these guys who do death-defying kind of things like deep caves, scuba diving, or other types of dangerous sports. There's such a thrill in it. So I think there's something about the thrill of being at the edge, or out of control, that people like. That it creates an adrenaline rush or an addiction that we can only get when we push ourselves to the edge. And nature is about one of the few ways we can do that, have that high safely. It's better than cocaine, it's safer than speed or whatever. So people become junkies on nature because they get to feel that rush of the thrill of being on the edge of maybe they're going to die, you know. And so there's probably something like that going on for some small percentage of the population. But generally speaking, I think most people live in their very safe bubbles, um, in urban settings and suburban settings. And even in rural settings, we're now all safely connected to the electrical grid, and maybe there's flooding, maybe there's an outage for a temporary period of time, but for the most part, everything's predictable and safe, so it feels. Even if you live in the northern part of Montana or the middle of Texas, you probably have clean water and you probably have electricity. And so my sense is that to a large extent, nature has been tamed. Our experience of nature has been tamed, and so we forget how vulnerable we are until we are unplugged from it and put in a situation where we don't have power, or we're lost at sea, or we get lost in the woods, and that's very humbling, and it wakes us up. Um, and I mean, I think as a culture, as a society, that's one of the things I ponder and worry about. Not really deeply worry about, but I just see the is it really wise for us to be so contingent upon electricity? Our food, our information, our communication, our gas, every single thing, if the electricity went out for some reason, is dependent upon electricity. We felt that in Texas, nearly 2 years ago, and the grid went down. And it's just like, whoa, it definitely humbles us. And we may have mastered so much, but we can easily be mastered by it if we're not careful. And I'm not a big survivalist or prepper or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But I just recognize that the impulse is that we need each other. We can't forget that, and we are not stronger uh, than the tools we've invented. Um, Sometimes, you know, we become weaker by the tools we've invented because we rely upon them, and we become weak and vulnerable because of that. So, um,
I like what you said about that. And it reminds me of that, kind of the workout paradigm, but that tension or that resistance or even danger, that's a growth opportunity,
yeah.
both in terms of, just literally having to test your limits,
Mhm.
but internally, and I'm assuming that you would say on a spiritual side as well, certainly from a humility standpoint. And if we don't do that, it tends to make us soft. And I'm not saying that, listen, we've had what, 60 something days over 100 degrees this summer. I like air conditioning.
Yeah.
Right. But I know what you're saying. And there's also a part that I don't want to say there's an enjoyment, but going through the harshness like that, there is something that feels good, and on both an adrenaline level and, even an accomplishment level, and just testing yourself, pushing yourself to the envelope. Yeah. I remember reading a story, and I don't recall his name, but a famous mountain climber, uh, who was actually quite judicious. And he was talking about some of the stories he had climbing the Himalayan peaks and a few close calls he had, and one in particular he decided not to go because he just didn't like the setup, and all of his colleagues died. And but he was still doing it even after they perished. And the writer asked him, why do you do this? And he said, well, and I think he had a family still and what have you. And he said, well, one of the reasons, quite frankly, is, our culture is going the other way, and kids need to know that. I think the actual term he said was, there's still badasses out there. And I don't think he meant that so much egotistical kind of way, but there are people that are willing to push that and show that it's possible, and all the things that the good that you get out of that and the growth that you get out of that. So it's just something I think about quite a bit, in addition to all the other aspects that we get. And I guess that leads me to this question for you, is that, again, in your own personal journey and what you do now, how do you, and what do you recommend for people, particularly those who, may not live next to a national forest, and are in more of an urban setting? How do you find God and spiritual fruits in nature today? What do you recommend? What are the things you do? And, are there some specific practices that, you could tell people that, can cultivate this?
Well, yeah, thanks. Um, I mean, I think half the population of the United States lives along the coasts, west or east or south. And so one of the things I did when I lived in downtown Chicago for 4 years, every day, whether morning or after dinner, I would take a walk down to Oak Street Beach. And though, the John Hancock Tower is right there behind me, and the Gold Coast condominiums were right there behind me, if I looked out to the east, I could only see the glory of the beautiful blue Lake Michigan and hear the waves crashing. And I couldn't even hear the sound of the traffic. And so I think the moral of the story is, find a place to take refuge and to remember your connection, and be fed by the beauty and the energies of nature. Um, and I think a lot of people are closer to the coastline than they might realize. They can go do that regularly. And the other thing is, I'd walk past this park called Newberry Park. Uh, it's the park right in front of Newberry Library. And in every season, that park was beautiful. It's a small park right there, just one block, but it had old trees in it. And so the trees hid the city, and I could just be with the trees as I walked through spring, summer, fall, and winter. And it was a very close park, urban park, but nevertheless the trees did something to me every time I visited. So I think there are sacred sanctuaries all around. You just have to find wherever you might live. And for those of people that are lucky enough to live, where they can drive 30 minutes or an hour outside of the suburban or urban setting, most of the country, you can easily get out and see land, open space. Most of the country is open space. So you don't have to go far to experience it. I think just taking walks, just to do that alone is therapeutic and deeply grounding, especially if you can walk in a forest or a field. Um, so those are simple things to do, I think, just to get out of your little bubble, and even getting your bare feet on the ground or lying on the grass with your body uh, is is energetically helpful and healing and restoring. I know here in Austin, there's this place called Barton Springs, and there's a grassy hill where I like to just lie on the grass underneath the big pecan trees, and then jump in the water and then dry off lying in the grass. And it's more therapeutic than all the counseling sessions I've ever been in. It's just energetically healing and very rejuvenating. It's almost impossible to describe, and
Yeah,
costs hardly anything.
yeah, when it's 104 outside and you jump in that water, it, it gets your attention, it wakes you up.
Yeah.
Uh,
But the
on me,
drying off is also part of the experience, because something about the evaporation of that water in sunlight or just in the air, the warm air blowing, is extraordinarily therapeutic.
As you were saying that, I was reminded of a well-known outdoorsman. I was listening recently, and he was saying that, with all the things going on in our world and the, loss of habitat and destruction, there's a lot of people, and I've certainly done this. I have some good friends who lament that and, become very remorseful. And I can understand why. But he said, the true outdoorsman or the true naturalist can always find something. They can lose their hunting spot, their fishing spot, where they're going hiking, and you can give them just a small patch of land or sea or whatever, and they can go zone in on that and just, have a tremendous experience in nature and nature connection and find so much enriching just in that one small thing. He goes, and gave a story about walking an urban landscape and watching the few people who would notice a bass in the river right in the middle of that in a spawning bed. And I thought that was such a beautiful story. And, the courses that I teach, one of the things I think that's so good about those, whether it's, something about foraging plants or wildlife tracking or bird language, is that you can do them almost anywhere and immediately gives you that connection. And I think, the fruits of what you were talking about. And so it doesn't mean all the other things that are going on are, good and what have you, but I think that's a good reminder. And not only that, I think it's stimulating. It's a learning experience. I'm going to ask you this really quickly about your story. I know there's a place that you would go walk in the prairie, these beautiful wildflowers, and I believe it's called Reimer's Ranch. And then you went out there one day and something happened and you were horrified, right? Do you mind sharing that story when it all turned black?
Oh, well, I think you're talking about the time I went out there and they had done prescribed burn. Yeah, uh, I just couldn't believe it. Um, but the next year and the year after, that those same fields were more abundant with wildflowers than ever before. So it was just totally shocking to me to see the scale of the burn, uh, and very bold to me because there's a lot of trees there, and I was stunned at the trees, how they were able to manage the
You
fire.
were worried, right, about things coming back? And
I really was worried, and I mean, it just looked so scarring. Like, how is anything going to come back to life? Yeah,
yeah, I think that's the amazing thing about nature. It's always surprising you. And, even something like that happens. And then if you're paying attention, you're like, wow, look
yeah,
at this coming to life again. The sort of creation process happening all over again. I'm always astounded by that when I see that, nature never stops trying.
yeah. It's so amazing to see. I mean, obviously, um, lightning strikes were very prevalent and did that sort of thing over the last, thousands of years here in North America. But now we need to do it for nature, apparently. Or I guess if it did start on fire by a lightning strike, they might try and put it out or control it. But it certainly is fascinating to me, that fire mitigation at the very least.
I read a study recently that I always had this question that, at least in this part of the world down here in the South Central Southwest, that Native Americans, they think, set about 3/4 of the fires here, versus lightning strikes. So most of them are man-made. And they did that to create habitat.
Yeah,
And there's a wonderful book about that,
and they
and
can
many other
control
things
where,
called,
move
yeah,
move the animals and
exactly.
hunt
Bring
them.
back the plants they want, clear brush. There's a book about California called Tending the Wild. But what was even more interesting was that their fires only burned about 40% of the landscape. The other 60%, even though it was a small percentage of the fire set, only about a quarter of them, they burned a majority of the land. And so they were doing things very intentionally. And again, it just, kind of reminded me of, you can work with nature, have it work for you if you do it in a smarter way. don't want to say you have the best of both worlds, but you can definitely have a connection with it, and yet at the same time do something that's beneficial or at least not harmful.
Yeah, I don't know if you mind if what you're talking about reminds me of a poem that I just came across. But if you mind me reading it,
No, by all means.
because it's just so poignant. It's by this guy named Red Hawk, who is a professor, and I don't believe that Red Hawk is his was his born name, but that's the name he's taken as an author. But just this poem gets at what you were talking about and the difference between how our culture has dominated culture. I mean, nature, whereas indigenous Native Americans lived in harmony or partnership with it in a way that oftentimes didn't make sense to the white man. But this is his poem called "Keepers of the Bones," and it's a very barbed criticism, but it's also a profound truth. To understand the white man's mind, you need look no further than the Smithsonian. In the basement, where the air is cooled and the humidity carefully controlled. That is where they keep the bones of the Indians, thousands of them. One section, half a block long, is just Indian skulls. They have examined the bones very closely, sectioned them under electron microscopes, carbon dated, analyzed and dissected them, weighed and measured them, catalogued, cross-referenced, and stored them. They put it all down in books, every ounce and scrap in boxes lining the wooden cases, row upon terrible row, and when the tribes ask them to return the bones for proper burial, the Smithsonian refuses. They say, these belong to the federal government, and the Indians believe it. In all their books, it does not say what they were looking for or if they ever found it. Once a reporter asked Sitting Bull why the Indians didn't bury their dead. He said, the crows and the worms, all the scavengers have to eat too. What good is the body to us once the spirit has left it? It belongs to the earth, not to us. And they took his picture for the paper. It's powerful.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, The Art of Dying by Red Hawk.
Now I know where Clint Eastwood got that line in his movie, Josie Wales. um, yeah, that's so poignant. And I think maybe wrapping up here that, throughout human history, even in some native cultures, there was always this tendency to, start controlling nature, but there's a way to do it and live more in harmony with it. Maybe not perfection, but, without abusing your resources, using them all up. And yeah. I think we have a lot to learn from, and they made some of their mistakes too, but there's a term called traditional ecological knowledge, and being able to work with that and utilize that, which is much less impactful. And again, I think a lot of these skills that we talk about, are able to do that in such a way that even if we maybe can't do it in mass in our culture, on a personal level, people can certainly get the benefits from it.
Yes. Well, we have so much to learn from the indigenous cultures, and I appreciate what you're doing to help that. And that image of, the Smithsonian basement, cataloging, studying, putting things underneath the magnifying glass, thinking to control and that now you've got it, and writing it down in books. And this is the Western mindset that's been dominant: to control, catalog, to preserve, to have storage. Loses the life force, but um, versus just letting the power of life unfold. One of the most helpful authors that's bringing, the Western mindset, the left brain thinking together with the right brain thinking. He's really worth reading. He's got a new book, 2-volume set called The Matter with Things. His name is Ian McGilchrist, and I just commend to your listeners this guy. He became famous for his book Master and His Emissary, and the Emissary, which is about the dual hemispheres, left and right, needing to harmonize. But his new two-volume set's massive. It's like 1,800 pages. But the second volume, volume two of The Matter with Things by Ian McGilchrist, is his summation of it all. And it's such a harmonization of the Eastern wisdom and with the Western knowledge, with indigenous, with the modern capitalism and culture. So much of this needs to be harmonized and woven together, rather than we're not going to solve it by making these guys wrong and these guys right. It's just more fighting. So there's got to be another way forward, and he presents it, and it's in beautiful ways, harmonizing um, matter and spirit, nature and technology, left and right. It's really quite extraordinary.
That sounds fascinating, and that maybe answers a question I remember reading or listening to Joseph Marshall, who's Oglala Sioux, and he was very much influenced by his grandfather, who I believe was either maybe born in a very young age, moved to a reservation, or might have been born on a reservation, but it was right after it started. And, this would have been around time frame of 1880s, sometime like that. And he was with his grandfather during the first moon landing. They watched it together, and he, imagined the changes that his grandfather had seen. And he had passed him along all these tremendous stories and wisdom sayings, that he had learned. And I encourage people to look it up. It's amazing, those stories. And so his grandson asked him, they're watching the moon landing, what he thought of it. And he said he paused and said, "That's a very impressive feat." And then he paused again and he said, "But I don't think they're very wise people." And I thought, how profound. I mean, it is technologically, it's an amazing thing, but so much of the other things that were, go along with it. And so I think that what you just, Ian McGilchrist,
Ian McGilchrist, yeah.
yeah, I think that finding a way, if we can, if possible, to, we're not going to be able to go back to Stone Age, obviously, unless it's forced
No.
upon us, but somehow to integrate those so that we can be more wise and get the benefits of, living closer to nature, be helpful for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, we're a people in a nation, that has decoded the human genome, all of it, and yet we still don't know how to live harmoniously with each other. Um, and there's so much violence, and uh, that's a great criticism. What a feat, all these things that we've done, and yet we're really just adolescents. We live in an adolescent culture led by adolescent, if not infantile leaders, um, who, aren't seeking the whole. They're seeking to win for this part and this part alone, I think, for the most part. And it's so hard to work for the whole. Everyone who works for the whole tends to get shot or killed, because it's the profits get taken out. They want to hold a bigger vision for the whole, and that's terrifying to a lot of people because they feel threatened by it. They would rather live in either or, me against you, I'm right, you're wrong, dualistic thinking, and it's just rooted in left brain, right brain stuff, and we've got to evolve beyond it if this many of us are going to live uh, in any kind of well-being on this planet. And escaping to another planet isn't going to help us. We just take ourselves. You know, I always say, it's not the people say, well, just read the Bible. And I say, well, okay, I'll read the Bible, but I'm more interested in who is reading the Bible and what is their consciousness that is reading the Bible. It's the consciousness that's in each of us that can expand and grow, and that's relating to nature and one another. And we live in very, very interesting times. I've never been more optimistic, but at the same time, it's very sobering.
Well, I know you're a hopeful person, and I think sometimes, I mean, I like so many things of Westernization, but we've probably gotten off track, or maybe the original idea, I think it was Aristotle, talked about the good life, but that was not so much a material thing, but internally, right? And maybe kind of getting back to that, or as I think it may have been Gandhi who said, asked about Western civilization, he said, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
And but I know you're an optimist, right? And you think, there's always hope for the future, and I certainly do. I don't know what that is in terms of ecology and the things we've been talking about, but if you have any last remarks on that.
I believe in the victory of consciously chosen love, and that love is what binds us all together, and that it is ultimate of importance. It's not only the ground from which we come, it's the teleos, where we're going, the end to which we're going. And without love, uh, nothing else sounds right. Nothing else will work. It's just it's the essential ingredient. And so whatever nurtures love, will nurture the environment. And um, there's a difference between being and existence. And in our culture, people have confused existence as being primary. And I'll put it this way, you know, being born gives you existence, but it doesn't give you being. Being comes from conception. Your beingness comes from conception, and your conception does not come from just you. And so, you know, there is something totally else involved in conception other than you. The woman brings a certain part of the chromosome, the man brings another part. So you can't get conceived on your own, and not only that, um, that life force that's coming down from one generation to the next comes from somewhere else. Life just didn't start here. So we've lost that perspective because it's so much easier to live in a flat land where we just say all that there is existence, and 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 forget about being. Um, and if we live in a world of just existence, the nightmare scenario is, where does being, what's the value of being then? And if it's just about existence, well, then you can wipe out whole categories of people or animals or species and not really think about it, because you've lost connection with being, that the sacredness of their existence is their being. And you can't create someone's being. You can't even create your own being. We're contingent. And that's where it's beyond theology, but it's not beyond spirituality. And you can be an atheist, ultimately, but I would just really put it to someone and say, how do you explain your own being? Where does it come from? You're more than your existence. You have a being. Where does it come from? And just as much as the elephants and the giraffes and the horses and the bumblebees, they all have different being, and each one is sacred. And I think that's what the native indigenous populations knew. They knew the sacredness of being. They couldn't create it or replace it. And we've forgotten that.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up, although we may have to continue this in another session. That launches a whole other set of topics. But thank you so much. Really appreciate those insights, Peter. You're doing wonderful work. And again, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, brother. It's good to see you.
Okay, take care. All right, bye-bye.